Again, welcome. We are talking about Beyond Your Enterprise authentication that works. I'm Kevin Holbert. We also have Zishan Bakir. Hope I said that right. Almost. And we're going to talk to you about security and authentication. We've got some related sessions. Later today, we're going to have server security the Tableau way. That's from 3 to 4 p.m. And then tomorrow, we're going to have connecting to data sources for Tableau server on Linux. So that's pretty exciting, especially if you're excited about server on Linux. And I'll give everybody a moment because I see people taking some photos. OK, cool. So we're going to talk about authentication in Tableau. We're going to talk about the options for authentication. We're going to talk about some common scenarios, key takeaways, and then hopefully we'll have a good bit of time for questions and answers. So let's talk authentication in Tableau Server. And when we talk about authentication in Tableau Server, we want to separate authentication and user store or identity management. So for example, your authentication mechanism may be something like SAML or OpenID. Your user store may be something like Active Directory, maybe an ERP system with a database of users, what have you. Your authentication mechanism many times is going to allow single sign-on with a transparent login. So basically, your users are going to hit the Tableau server and just be let right in so that they have a seamless experience like so many of your other applications in your organization provide. So let's talk about identity management. We have a couple ways to do that in Tableau server. First and foremost, we have what we call local. Local means it's Tableau server specific. The username and password are stored in Tableau. They don't necessarily need to be remotely related to what you have in Active Directory or whatever other identity store you're using. This can be useful when you have a scenario where maybe you're providing Tableau for external users. This can also be combined with our REST API and SAML to be able to federate users across multiple domains or multiple stores of users, basically. So again, maybe I have branch offices and they're all in separate domains. It might be necessary, depending on how our network and our domains and our forest is configured, we bring those users in locally and then authenticate them against another mechanism. Alternatively, we can offer Active Directory. I'd imagine most people here are familiar with Active Directory. The usernames can be imported to Tableau. We can even import at the group level. And we have built-in sync capabilities, so we can tell Tableau server, hey, I want you to sync these user groups every day at 10 a.m., for example. We can also do multiple domains. Now, on the slide, we're saying multiple domains with a one-way trust. The caveat here, and something to think about, is that may depend. You may need two-way trust in certain scenarios, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Oh, and coming soon, we're going to have LDAP available. So try our beta for Linux. That'll be available in that. So again, we have our identity store. We have local and external. And you can kind of see in this matrix which other authentication mechanisms are available for you to use in combination with those. So I'm just going to leave this up for a moment so you can take a look at it or take a photo. Cool. What's that? Yes, the slides, yeah. This presentation will be available to download after the conference. Awesome. Okay. So, basic authentication. What's built into Tableau right out of the box? What don't you have to worry about? So, local and AD built right into Tableau, doesn't require any other third-party component. It's going to use your username and password. You can provide native SSO via Active Directory with SSPI. That's built right into the Windows operating system. And for so many of our users and our administrators out there, this is their primary method of authentication. It's just good old Active Directory. And something popped up on my screen. OK. If we want to take that a step further, we can kind of move up to Kerberos. Kerberos is a newer generation technology, primarily driven by Microsoft. If you need Kerberos, you probably know who you are in this room. It's most commonly used to authenticate to your SQL Server or your Hadoop, your Postgres, Teradata, Hive. Basically, Kerberos is a ticket generating system. It generates a secured ticket based on authenticating who a user is, provides them essentially a token or ticket, and then that ticket is redeemed by our application. And that's going to let them right in. Cool. Pretty straightforward on Kerberos. Kerberos is incredibly easy to implement because, again, it's a technology built right into the Windows Server system. And our configuration for Kerberos requires very few steps. And it's easy to configure it and test it right in our configuration window. And again, I'm not going to be getting too in-depth in these things today because we want to leave time for questions and answers at the end. And again, this will be available, and this is all documented on our website, but I just want to kind of cover these technologies in brief to give you your options. So SAML. SAML is Security Assertion Markup Language. SAML is probably the most used authentication mechanism in larger organizations, and our largest customers are predominantly using SAML. Why? Because SAML allows you to establish trust between your Tableau server and what's called an IDP, or identity provider. And that identity provider can be a piece of technology like Okta, Ping Federate, Shibboleth. There's a lot of different options out there. It allows you to federate your users across multiple domains or multiple spheres of content and internal and external. So for example, again, if you're providing Tableau as a service to external users, maybe your clients, maybe you have franchises, and they're all in separate domains, we are able to federate all those so that we can trust the SAML, and then we can just allow the users right into Tableau. SAML primarily secures things by using SSL certificates. We can also take that a step further. We offer what's called site-specific SAML. How many here are familiar with the concept of sites in Tableau Server? Oh, good, most of you. So for those of you that aren't, sites are a way to allow you to effectively create almost like a second virtualized Tableau server. It's a separate content container with separate users. The content and the data, the users, the permissions, it's all segregated from one another. So that means that if I have Coke in one site and Pepsi in another, never shall the twain meet. So the great news about that is I can take that and then I can enable site-specific SAML. Site-specific SAML will allow me to use different SAML providers for my different sites. Again, this is great when I'm providing Tableau as a service, or maybe I'm a large government organization providing IT services for healthcare departments and welfare departments and city municipal services. This allows all of those organizations who may have varying security requirements to be able to get into Tableau using their own SAML provider. So that's a really cool thing that you can do there. Next, we have mutual SSL. Mutual SSL allows you to provide a certificate to the client and a certificate to server. Both of these certificates need to be signed by the same certificate authority. And so you're going to provide Tableau the certificate authority file. This is the biggest takeaway from this slide, is if you want to use mutual SSL, you need to have access to that CA root certificate that was used to sign, because that's the only way we can trust those client and server certificates. But what this allows us to do is SSL effectively allows us to establish trust. An SSL certificate is like an escrow company or title company. Basically, they're saying, you can trust this person because I certified that they are who they say they are. And then using that for authentication, it's again going to give your users a seamless experience. We can even have the usernames in the specific certificates, so that way we can map a username to a specific certificate. And then if we need to revoke that username, for example, maybe they left the company or they moved to a different job, we can revoke that and remove their access very easily. And a lot of the great thing about that in SSL is a lot of that can be automated using various tools that can manipulate SSL. Next, we have trusted tickets. So trusted tickets is a pretty fun one. It's something that we created a long time ago. And essentially, it's very similar to Kerberos in that it's a ticket generating system. Essentially, we take a intermediate host, whether it's a reverse proxy or another web server. For example, a very common scenario. I have visualizations and dashboards that I want to provide to my users, but you know what, I want a more guided experience, or I want to put them in our internal wiki or an internal SharePoint or intranet site. What's the easiest way to do that? How do I get them authenticated and have them feel seamless? Or maybe I don't really necessarily want to provide them their username and password. I just want them to see a dashboard. Trusted Tickets allows me to say, hey, Tableau server, trust this host. Again, that host being that web server, portal, or proxy. And then when a user comes to that portal, maybe you have a separate authentication mechanism for that, so they're going to authenticate to that. Then they're going to hit the page where the dashboard is. That page is going to have a little snippet of code in it that effectively says, hey, Tableau server, I have Jay Smith. Is he a valid user? And if so, can I have a ticket? Tableau ideally is going to say, yes, Jay Smith is a valid user. Here's your ticket. The client is then going to get passed through to Tableau server, redeeming that ticket. One ticket, one view. We can do a thing called unrestricted tickets that lets them into the rest of the server. However, that's not ideal because the primary use for trusted tickets, again, one ticket, one view. We can also do things like client IP matching, so that way there's to prevent any kind of potential session hijacking and just kind of up the security level. There's a lot of cool things we can do with trusted tickets. It's a great technology. OpenID Connect. So fun fact, a lot of people don't know this, but if you have a beard, it gives you the power to summon other people with beards. So I'm going to bring Blake on stage, and he's going to talk to us about OpenID Connect, because this was his feature. Thanks, Blake.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Check. Hey,
All right.
Thank you, Kevin. Zishan and Kevin and I have been working on the past couple of days, and people have been looking at us going, oh, hey, it's the beard crew. But anyway, so a couple of years ago, I was a program manager and product manager at Tableau, and Zishan and I worked on the same team, and as Kevin said, this was one of my features, as was Mutual SSL, so I'm happy to answer questions about that, too. Anyway, I've only got about 2 minutes, and this is probably the second time I've seen the slide, so I'll share a few notes that jotted down this morning. OpenID is a newer standard. It is very similar to SAML, and you can think of it, it exactly is, an authentication layer on top of the OAuth 2.0 authorization standard. Come on, pull those guys back up. Apologies. There we go. Yeah, so basically, it came along as an answer to a lot of the security problems that were going on and the difficulty that smaller websites originally had with building their own authentication and authorization subsystems. And the OIDC standard was intended to allow those site providers to offload the authentication process, that it's often very complicated, to the bigger parties like Google, Facebook, Ping, to handle that for them. So basically the user logs in, they can click that button, sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google. Whenever you do that, you're using OpenID. Just click the button, sends a claim. It's a claims-based auth system, sends a claim over to the OP, kind of like in SAML, you've got the IDP. In OpenID, it's called the OP. Anyway, the OpenID provider, I think. Anyway, but yeah, so you send the claim over. There's some magic that happens behind the scenes. Send something back, and there's some redirection that goes on, and then eventually the user is signed in. You're provided with I think they call it not the claim. I'm totally blanking. It's been a few months since I've looked at this, but basically you're provided a code that's unique to that user, globally unique on your system, and from that point forward, that's why after you've signed into an app with Google, you don't need to sign in or authenticate and provide your credentials again, because they've got that secret stored for you on their systems. In short, it's like I said, it's very similar to SAML. It's very easy to set up. It's more secure. There are a number of security features built into the way that those requests and the payloads are authenticated within the OP. But generally, if you're already using SAML, go ahead. You're generally going to be okay sticking with SAML. If you're working on something new, OpenID has been getting a lot of momentum in general, and especially within our customers. We shipped it at the time. We thought we only had a couple of customers that were interested, and ever since we shipped, the demand and interest has exploded in a fairly surprising way. So anyway, that's my spiel. Thank you, everybody. Kevin, bring the beard back up.
All right. You can take the microphone down with you. All right. Thanks so much, Blake. And next up, we're going to talk about authentication for your enterprise. Zishan's going to come up, and he's going to talk about various scenarios, and starting with simple for like a single deployment, and working up to more and more complex situations. Hopefully, you'll see something that's similar to your scenario in these, and he's going to tell you about the various combinations of technologies available to solve the security and authentication mechanism for that solution. All right.
Thanks, Kevin.
You're welcome.
Hello, everyone. I'm Zishan. I'm a product manager in the server and cloud platform team, and I own authentication area as well. So that's why, we're talking here. First of all, really thank you again for being here for TC. It's a great time, to meet people who have similar interests, who are, working on similar thing to enable data for more and more people within their organizations. And I think everyone has, a unique journey with data within their enterprise. But as we have seen, there are some things which are common, like, for example, the way Tableau grows in different organizations. We have seen, there are some data enthusiasts, data geeks that, that just start showing people the value of data, what can be enabled with more, data-driven decisions. And from there, it goes on, and you basically, from tens of users, you have hundreds of users, and then you have thousands of users. So it's a growth path that we have seen with a lot of customers. And in that kind of journey, it's important to know that the way you started, maybe you only had users within a single department that you were dealing with. But as you grow, you have to handle users from across multiple departments, or from your partners or vendors, or even your customers that you are sharing insights with. So that's the kind of scenarios that we are going to discuss in the remaining part of the presentation. And during those scenario discussion, if you have a similar scenario and you are using auth type, please feel free to chime in. So the first one, we'll start with the simplest one. This is where someone initially starts with Tableau Desktop, or a small Tableau deployment of Tableau server. And here, in most cases, what we have seen, the idea is to get a deployment running as quickly as possible. So in most cases here, the IT is not involved, and whoever's deploying, they are just deploying based on the quickest and the simplest approach in terms of authentication that's available. So the most common cases we see in these scenarios are the basic auth, as Kevin talked about, that it's very simple. It gets you up and running very quickly without a lot of understanding of how different auth mechanisms work, and how it will work with your larger organization. So it's something that's used very commonly, but you can see all other options are available. But of course, at that point, when it's only tens of users, it doesn't. What we have seen, it doesn't, validate that have to spend so much time in figuring out what will be the right approach and then implementing that. So this is the most common scenario. And then, as you see, you might have seen in your cases as well. You start using Tableau, you start seeing, more and more people, requesting for the whizzes, and you start sharing it broader, and you have more departments, who are interested in this technology. So at that point, you have multiple departments who are using Tableau. And in this case, first, what we commonly see is that departments might just go and have their own Tableau server set up. But of course, having multiple Tableau server deployments within a single enterprise or organization, it adds to more overhead. So what's a common, way to solve that problem is to have a shared deployment. But in this case, as you see, that having a shared deployment will mandate that, you align with the sign-in mechanisms that are used for other applications within your organization. For example, no one likes to remember multiple passwords. It's a pain, especially when you have to change passwords, every few weeks. So here, it's important to get, understand what your enterprise-wide authentication standards are, and engage your IT department, and to make sure that you are going on a path which will be supported by your IT organization, because it allows for better governance, better security across your deployment, which is growing. So here you could have, from hundreds of users, you could be growing to thousands of users. So here you can see that some of the common single sign-on mechanisms, SAML, Mutual SSL, OpenID Connect, those are the technologies that we see commonly being used. So while this is still within the same enterprise or organization, some of the scenarios we see which are getting more common day by day is that let's say there's a bank and they have a partner company who's a brokerage company, and essentially their customers are the same. So they need data which is essentially the same, which is about the same customers. So now the bank wants to share data with their partner, which is a brokerage company. Or in other cases, we have seen, like Kevin was mentioning, a government has multiple agencies working for it, and they want to share the data. So in those kind of cases, now you have users which are coming from outside of your organization. So in this case, they are not definitely sharing the same identity store in the beginning. So let's say if you were using local auth, it is possible to pull in those users into your identity store, but that's not easy. And then as we talked about the multiple domain scenario, so those are also some scenarios that come into play here. So if one-way trust, you are able to establish one-way trust between the domain where Tableau server is installed and where the external users are coming from, then you can enable with those technologies as well. But the more common approaches that we are seeing are, for example, using site SAML, because it's very likely that the external users, you wouldn't like to give them control across the whole Tableau server. So you'll probably have a site which is containing the data that's required by the external users. So you can just let that site being visible to the external partner that you have. And then OpenID is also very useful. And if you are using multiple AD domains, then Kerberos could be a solution there as well. So moving on from that scenario, the other scenario we are seeing with one of our largest customers is that they will have their own solution. Let's say they are in healthcare and they are servicing multiple hospitals or multiple healthcare providers, and they manage and provide the data for patients, data for all the doctors and all that. So they are essentially the OEM, which is providing and has the Tableau server deployed on their infrastructure as well. So in this case, it's not just external. You have multiple external entities which are totally independent, which rely on the Tableau server deployment that you have. And in this case, of course, security becomes extremely important because these are all totally separate customers, and you can't have them access to someone else's data. So in these kind of cases, the options become much more limited. As you can see, there are external auth. For example, with AD, it won't work because it's highly unlikely that you'll have users from multiple customers being part of the same AD. And so most customers are doing today, they are using local auth, local identity store, and then with that they use either site SAML or they use OpenID Connect. By that way, as I said, with site SAML, they are able to just give access to a particular site for a particular customer. And we have had multiple requests from our customers that they use the same ability with OpenID as well. So you should be able to, let's say, have OpenID for a few of the sites and then maybe SAML for a few other sites. So that's the kind of scenarios that we are hearing more about from our larger customers. And so these are some of the common scenarios and patterns we see around user authentication with our customer with their data journey, from small to large to extra large. And now I think we can move to the key takeaways. So in terms of the key takeaways, I think it's important to understand wherever you are in your journey with data to see who are all the users, where they're coming from, and what are the authentication mechanisms that will work for those users. For example, if there are external users involved, then your options become a little more limited right now. And then, as we discussed, you have to see if, for example, if you're doing SAML or if you're doing OpenID, how does it work with your existing organization's identity and auth infrastructure? And the other thing is that what clients are being used. For example, if you're using mobile, today, unfortunately, we don't have OpenID support for mobile clients. So you have to be careful in terms of what clients are being used. For example, if it's all three, like browser, desktop, and mobile, then SAML would be a better option. And the other thing is that, as I said, that as the deployments grow, it's really important to understand what's mandated by your IT department and how and what would work better with the infrastructure that you already have, because you don't want to invest a lot of time and effort in setting up something which won't be agreed upon by the organization in terms of how they are authenticating for other applications. And then one other call out is, okay, it's not working. Okay, you're back. Yeah, so another call out again with Tableau server on Linux beta. So this is out already, and it comes with some very good features that our customers have been asking for. For example, LDAP support. This has been on top of our list in terms of our authentication backlog. So it's out there. You can try it out. And actually, LDAP will enable some of those scenarios where you can essentially virtualize your identity store. And for example, even if you have external customers, you can have a single virtual LDAP directory, which will take care of all of your users, both internal and external. And you then could use SAML, OpenID, those kind of technologies on top of that. And then other thing is that in some cases, customers have asked that they'd like to use Kerberos for their Windows authenticated data sources, for example, for Oracle or SQL. But their user authentication is, let's say, with SAML. So that's also a feature that we are adding in the beta. So let's say you'll be able to set up Kerberos for your data authentication, whereas you could still use SAML for user authentication. And then we are introducing a brand new way of setting up authentication through the Tableau Services Manager. It will have both the CLI and the API support. And all of your settings related to authentication, you'll be able to do it with that new interface. Today, as you might know, that you have to use tab config for most of the authentication settings, and then there are some added commands in tab admin that you use to further tweak those settings. So we are combining all of the operations that are required by our customers in this new interface. So that should make it simpler to both set up once and then also automate your settings. So with that, I think we are almost at the end of our presentation, and we'd like to open it up for questions.
You mentioned about enabling access to external users and some of the options, but what I have experienced is, is it even possible to customers who are not in AD, because your employees are in AD, but your customers are not, and there's if you use AD, it's at the server level. It's not possible right now to have even if with separate sites. I know one site will use AD and the other not. Is that possible, or will that problem be solved with any of these future releases?
Yes, so that's a great question. So as I mentioned, if there are scenarios where there are a lot of external users involved, today customers switch to local identity store. So essentially, and then they are externalizing, the authentication to, let's say if they're using SAML, they use Ping Federate or Okta, and then they basically gather all the users, both internal and external, and they are authenticating from there. But for AD, as I said, it might be possible to set up one-way trust with your external users. So then you'll be able to pull in users from your external, which is not part of your forest. It's totally external Active Directory. So that's something which some of the customers have tried, but it has caveats in terms of, if you are using Kerberos for authenticating to data sources, then you have to be careful, that, where is your run as user residing. But it is possible. But the most common case we see is that customers switch to local identity store, and then they do it, from that. So they have to manage all the yeah. Yeah. And in future, as I said with LDAP, it will open up more options, because now you could have a single virtual LDAP directory which contains both, your internal and external users, and then you'll be able to manage that. Yes, great question. So the question is if LDAP would be available for Linux only or for Windows as well. So the beta that's available right now, it's for Linux, but early next year, the preview would be available for Windows as well.
Hi there. Thanks for the overview of various authentication methods. We are kind of a new customer to Tableau, and we are in a similar situation where you explained there are multiple customers and you need to segregate the data. Could you explain or go one step further to help me understand how that can be achieved? Basically, it's the same data set based on the customer who is authenticated. The data would be different for them. Thank you.
Kevin would like to take that?
So the example given was you have
Okay, so the question is, you have multiple healthcare organizations with different users, but same data requirements?
yeah, data set, the structure is the same, but when they access using their specific user ID, the data they're getting back is depending on the authentication of the user. Similar to what was explained in the hospital.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Probably, ideally, the best way to go about doing that is using, well, let's qualify the question. So the users, are they all allowed to see the same data, and then you want to filter the data by who the user is? Okay, so you'd probably want to look at just using SAML, and then like a combination of either user filters or row-level security to ensure that your users are only seeing the data that they should be seeing in the dashboards that you've published to them. That'd probably be the easiest way to go about that. That's going to be on the database side. So, and then you can align that with the Tableau server side through your dashboard design. So, SAML user filters, which allows us to detect who's logged into the Tableau server, and then filter based on maybe they're part of a security group, or they're part of a region, or a specific hospital or clinic. And so we can detect that and then filter the data as appropriate just for them. Okay.
This regarding one of the key takeaways. One of the things mentioned was include user credentials in the authentication. What's the use case for that? One of the points mentioned in the key takeaways, one of the slides, maybe third or fourth point, was to include user credentials in the authentication.
Yes, so that was for data source authentication. So you can have transparent login into Windows authenticated data sources, for example, Oracle, SQL, Impala. So if you have such a scenario, then you'll require Kerberos, which allows you to, for example, if you're logging in as a user, it will send your credentials straight to the database to authenticate. So again, it depends on if you have those databases, and if you want transparent login setup, then you'll need that.
Does that imply that each data source is specifically?
No, they are independent. But when they are logging in, then it will make sure that the user has access to that data source or to the database.
So, yeah, I'm super new to Tableau, so don't look at my name tag in case I say something dumb. The OpenID Connect. I was listening to the question, and you mentioned row-level security. With OpenID Connect, you'd be sending over a JavaScript web token, which would have claims in it. One of those would be roles for our users. Is that something I can use in the row-level security, or can we read any of the attributes on the OpenID Connect ticket to do any kind of filtering?
Yeah, so today that's not possible because the authentication attributes are not sent down, at the data level. So the row level security that Kevin was talking about is set up totally separately, and but this is a feature request that we are now hearing from multiple customers. So it is on our backlog in future to allow using attributes from the user authentication and make it control authorization to specific data that a user might have access to or not.
So none of the attributes, like if I had an ID or anything else for
not
the user,
today.
nothing comes through?
Yeah.
Then if I'm using OpenID Connect, does that mean I'd have to pre-import all my users? Because OpenID Connect means all my users are in another system, right? So I wouldn't be able to do any kind of row or security based on
So the thing
roles?
is, you can do OpenID Connect with our local identity store. So when you do that, Tableau has those users as well, because Tableau needs to match when the claim comes back. So Tableau local identity store will contain all those users. So then you can do the row level security and user filters based on that.
That means I am importing them first? That means I am importing them
Yeah,
first
yeah.
to the local store?
You need to have them in Tableau as well.
So we're going to try to get to all of your questions. If we do run out of time, feel free to follow me and Z into the hallway if we get kicked out of the room. But we're going to try to get to all of you. So.
Yeah, very pertinent to the last question. Is there plans for just-in-time provisioning of users in Tableau?
It's another ask that comes pretty frequently, but it's not on the near-term backlog. But yes, it's an ask that keeps on coming up. If you have a question here.
So the different spin on this one?
Take the mic, please.
Different spin on this one?
Yeah.
So there's a great automatic sync feature for the Active Directory. Are there any publicly available or kind of like scripts to do to automate the local store sync?
Yeah, so for local store, we have REST APIs available, which you can use to import users and to manage.
Right. Well, are there anything? Is there anything ready that I can just basically take and kind of configure?
You're looking for a sample.
Yeah,
that's available.
sample or something.
Yeah, I think we have some samples on our GitHub, but we can discuss that.
Yeah, we have a GitHub. It's called github.com/Tableau, and there's a lot of great sample scripts. I've got a gentleman back here who's been waiting very patiently, and I don't want to ignore one side of the room. So,
if I have users who need to be part of a site that's shared between two different customers, and they both have different SAML IDPs, is there a way to, besides load some kind of third-party bridging IDP in the middle, is there another way to have people log in through different IDPs to the same site?
Not today, but it's something that we are hoping will come in future. Similar scenarios we have heard from customers that, for example, domain-based authentication. So based on the domain that the user represents, then use a different IDP. So not even tied with a site. But today, a site has to be tied to a single IDP.
So we are using SAML, and it's very difficult to configure SAML configuration, I think, our experience. So have you any advice or any best practice how to handle, how to debug SAML configuration? Because it took us weeks and nights, and it's horrible.
Kevin is the man.
This is what I spend a lot of time doing. So the question is all about how do we debug SAML, how do we troubleshoot that? So there's a few key core things in SAML that if you get them right, everything should just work. And if you get them wrong, it can be very confusing because you're like, what did I do wrong? So the first is SAML requires a very specific kind of certificate, and that's where a lot of people go wrong out of the gate, is we require what's called an X509 PEM encoded certificate with a .crt extension. So it has to be that exact format. It has to have been signed using a key that does not have a passphrase. So that's another one where people get stuck on. Finally, we require out of the box that the attribute ID, for those of you that don't know, when you send a SAML assertion, we're looking for an attribute. An attribute in this case would be the username. So we're looking to match on that username. Now, depending on how you've configured your IDP, it might be sending us a lot of other stuff as well, or it may not be the username that we use. A common scenario might be that your username in Active Directory might be a string of digits and letters, which is common, and then it maps to your first and last name. We might see that a little differently in Tableau. And so what generally we want is if you're JSmith in Active Directory or whatever you're federating from SAML, you need to be JSmith in Tableau as well. So those are kind of the big core takeaways of that. There's a few others, like in our configuration window, you want to make sure that you don't put a trailing slash after the URL for your Tableau server. You want to make sure that there's no proxies or firewalls in the way that are messing with that packet or stripping things. And finally, if you're struggling that much, please reach out to us. We want to help you. Chances are we can get that done in a pretty quick troubleshooting session. There's also a setting, and it's in our documentation, where we can increase the log level of a particular log so that we can get more details about what's happening underneath. But I'd say those are kind of the core things to start with. And then if it's still not working, then yeah, reach out to Tableau and let us help you. So.
There's a question there as well.
Okay. This one? Okay. I'm letting you pick. So.
So we have a Tableau server with 4 sites, and one site has 3 authentication providers, and the remaining 3 have their own authentication provider. So can we configure a site per SAML in that case?
So as I said, right now for a site, you can only have one IDP. You cannot have multiple IDPs per site. So if, as you're saying, you need 3 different IDPs for a single site, that you won't be able to configure that today.
No, what we have done is, it's working for us because we are using a proxy IDP.
Yep.
And then we are able to get the users in.
Yeah,
but then can we have the site per SAML with a proxy IDP?
Yeah. That you can do that, because as long as there's a single IDP, which is your proxy in this case, then you can do it. So then you can have site SAML, and let's say you're using the proxy IDP on one of the site, and then for other sites you're using something else.
Okay, thank you.
There's also another scenario that we didn't cover, which is site SAML, but it also allows server plus site SAML. So if you do have one large IDP that is federating multiple other things and you want to use that for the general server-wide, you can then say, by default, we're going to have sites use this server-wide SAML. Then let's say that you have a organization or a business unit that wants to have 2-factor authentication, so that necessitates them needing a separate IDP. We can then say, all right, well, for this site, we're going to have a separate SAML, but it won't affect the rest of the users. And we had a question here.
So we have a server that's set up. It's been in place for just a few years, and it's using Active Directory for authentication. And we now have a use case where we want to authenticate external users. They're in a Google Apps domain. So I'm really new to this, so I've been looking at all the different things, and it seems like there's always some, oh, we can't do this if you have AD turned on, or this only works in local. So is there some way for us to avoid having to remake our server and authenticate our people from Google Apps?
Yes and no. That's always a tough one. When you wake up one day and what's been working fine for years, like Active Directory in your scenario, and suddenly you have this new requirement. There's no easy answer to that question, because currently we can't do both Active Directory and local. Ideally, what you could do, though, is you could restore your content to the server Like, so you could spin up like a new instance of server, configure it for local, restore all your content, and remap the permissions and start syncing your users. Blake might have an idea actually on that.
Well, the thing I was going to mention is that when you're, this is a problem we ran into when we introduced OpenID. One of the first customers to take it on had an all AD system and was moving to OpenID, and because OpenID is strictly local auth, we had to move them from AD to local. And the challenge with simply doing, this was the part that I was going to mention, the challenge with doing a simple restore, backup restore, as any of you guys have ever done, you end up with all these orphan user accounts, you end up with content ownership issues and so on. The easiest way to do that when you have to switch between local auth and AD is to use the site import export feature. And the reason I say that is that site import export has a capability to map user accounts in your source site to the user accounts in your destination site. So that is a pro there. And this customer had, I don't even know, probably 150,000 users in their deployment and maybe 100 sites, 150 sites. It was a huge number. And they were able to script this process and work through it and migrate their entire deployment very successfully using site import export. As far as being able to use the Google apps, is there a way that you could theoretically use AD with your SAML? I'm really spitballing here because I want to.
No, I think the first approach you mentioned is the one, the straightforward approach today.
So we may not be able to convince everyone that has control over it that that's what we need to do.
Okay.
So maybe we can take this offline.
Sure.
Yeah, we'd be happy to take that offline. So, yeah.
So I'm the site administrator, and our client wants to be in charge of setting up the user IDs. But they can't have access to the data sources or the reports. So how can we set up an account where they can only create users and give them permissions, but see nothing else?
Yeah, that's, again, a request that's coming more often now.
Okay.
It is not possible today, unfortunately, but this is something which we are, which is on our backlog. So hopefully, in next few releases, So the idea is that we have different roles for admin. So there are requests for admin roles with no access to content, which will address your scenario. Then there's similar requests where admins can, troubleshoot permissions for their users to make sure that their users have the right permissions. So these things are on our backlog, but they're not possible today.
Is there any idea, like, when that could be possibly coming?
No, I won't have timelines right now, but as I said, we have started investigating those scenarios.
Okay.
So that's the good thing, that it's on our backlog and we have started.
I was in a session earlier where they were talking about REST API. Is there a way to create an interface, like through a web tool that uses REST API to insert those users into Tableau?
Yeah, you can add users through REST API. So yeah, that could be a workaround, that you provide them a tool which only uses the REST API to add or remove users.
Okay.
And yeah, you'll have to build that tool on top of the REST API.
But that would be like a web tool where you can actually create a user, and then through that tool, it inserts the users into Tableau behind the scenes, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
The thing to keep in mind is that the server, whatever account that tool is running under, would need to be able to authenticate to Tableau server. So there would need to be some account that it's running under. So maybe something else, but that is visible to whoever's consuming the web app.
Yeah. So using the REST API, and I've seen this done many times for like creating custom portals where users, where administrators need to do kind of that same scenario. And it's definitely possible to create a little microsite where they can go and say, you can do like a user authorization, add user form, they punch in the details and then that passes to the Tableau server and then they're able to add the user. I think the trick with that would be though, is just not letting them log into the Tableau server directly, so.
So the tool, the web tool that they're using to create user ID would be an admin?
Yes. Yeah, it would require that they be an admin to Tableau server. However, you could hide those credentials behind the scenes and not give them to them directly.
Yeah.
So.
Hi, so I have, it's kind of a detailed question, but my site admin is here too, so he might. Tableau. One of our goals is that we have some dashboards that we create in our group. Some of them are for specific to only certain people in the group to see, but some of them are dashboards that we want to embed in a SharePoint site for everybody that wants to could look at in our organization. We don't want to have them to have access to the Tableau server necessarily, because then we'd have to add them and all of this other stuff. So what is the best scenario for if you want open to be able to display those to people in your organization?
Great question. Very common scenario. The good news is it's actually quite easy to do what you want. We're going to use a combination of groups and projects and trusted tickets. So you're going to be embedding into SharePoint using trusted tickets for authentication. Your users will have access to the Tableau server in the sense that they'll have usernames to match those trusted tickets to. However, they're not usernames that you necessarily need to share with them. And also setting our permissions at the project level and working down, we can say this project is explicitly for workbooks that we're sharing with the rest of the organization, and all of your other projects, simply the way permissions in Tableau work, if I don't give you access to a thing, you have no access to it at all, and you're not even going to see that it exists. So even if they did somehow manage how to figure out how to log into the Tableau server, if you haven't given them access to any additional content, they're only going to see that content that's available to them on the SharePoint. Does that? Okay, cool.
And another thing to add is, I'm not sure if you have looked at guest access. So there's a capability which is known as guest access. You haven't turned it on? So that's something you could also try it. And the good thing is that now it's available per site. So you could enable guest access for some sites and have it disabled for other sites. And then you don't even need any account. A non-user can just come in and view those wizards which have guest.
Right now we have set no guest access to the Tableau server because we don't know who logs in there.
Yeah, yeah.
This is a data governance issue.
Yeah. Yeah, so these are the options based on what Kevin said.
Yeah.
We have big IP on top of our cluster and single sign-on, and that have made our trusted authentication not to work. And as far as we knew or read, this is a year back, we couldn't use trusted authentication with single sign-on.
He's saying that they had big IP on top of the trust authentication. So, yeah, reach out to your sales consultant because I think there's some solutions that we can work with there. But I think that one's probably, it's pretty specific. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us after the conference and we'll take a look at it and help you figure out what the best option is for your scenario. So.
Can I ask one other question?
Oh, go ahead.
So if we do have access to everybody as viewer, are they able to filter, see everything on the dashboard as it's set up, or do they have to have Interactor to be able to navigate through the dashboard however you have it set up?
Now we will set them up as interactive. We're not going to play with the user stuff. We're going to give them access to the dashboard.
Okay, yeah, but yeah, no, that's correct. They need to be interactors to interact. So, yeah, I generally don't recommend you use Viewer unless you have like a static kiosk that is just displaying data for people.
So as we have, I think, 7 minutes.
Okay.
So I think what we can do, we can just scale out. I'll turn off my mic, and there are a few questions I'll try to address, and you can address questions here.
Oh, sure, yeah. So what in case you didn't catch it, we're just going to turn off the mics and just kind of walk around and try to answer as many questions as possible.